Hello everyone, I'm Jen and I make useful English Lit study videos on Shakespeare, poetry, fiction, literary devices and more to help you get top grades in the subject. So in today's video, we are going to be taking on one of the most popular themes in Othello, race. Is Othello a play that is preoccupied with race? And is the protagonist a victim of racism? We're going to examine these questions by analysing Othello's status as an outsider in Venetian society. And we're going to do it by looking at three key ideas. So make sure that you watch till the very end of this video to get all of my top grade ideas on this very important theme and character. Now, before we even dive into those questions, it's important that we consider whether racism as we understand it today was even an established concept back in Shakespeare's time. Now, chances are, if you're studying a play like Othello at school, you're probably living in a liberal, progressive society where racial bigotry is not tolerated and anyone who espouses racist views would be deemed a social pariah. But back in Shakespeare's time, equality was not really a thing. People understood that some were just born higher than others, and others low. Just think about the great chain of being. And this sort of distinction between high and low people wasn't just determined by race, but also factors like gender, class, rank, and religion. So when we ask questions like, is Iago racist or is Othello a victim of racism, we run the risk of being anachronistic, i.e. ignoring the historical realities of when the play was written. Perhaps a more meaningful point to explore would be to think of Othello as an outsider in general. How does Shakespeare present Othello as an outsider in the play? Is Othello's outsider status only defined by race? And how is his difference perceived by the other characters in the play? Now, in order to answer these questions, we have to first understand the context. Now, one thing to remember when looking at the context of any literary work is that the story and the author's contexts are very often different. Take Shakespeare, for example. With Shakespeare, there was his own Elizabethan and Jacobean England, and then there is the other one in which the plays are set. For instance, Macbeth is set in 11th century Scotland, while Hamlet takes place in 14th century Denmark. So Othello was written in 1603, which happens to be the year in which Elizabeth I was succeeded by James VI. But the play itself is set against the turbulent backdrop of the Ottoman-Venetian War from 1570 to 1573, during which Cyprus was a colony of Venice. Now, towards the end of Elizabeth I's reign, international trade started opening up, and trading links were established between England, the Mediterranean, the Ottoman Empire, and North Africa. With this came more cross-border movement of peoples, and one result of this was the contracting of African and Arabic Moors as these military mercenaries, who were foreign soldiers hired to fight on behalf of a sovereign state. So military men were, in a way, political commodities. And this is a very important point to remember as we go on to analyse Othello's outsider status. Because of course, Othello is exactly one such mercenary, being contracted by Venice to fight against the Turks in Cyprus, which had been a Venetian colony until the Ottoman Empire seized the territory in 1573. But regardless of the fictional context, it's always important that we bear in mind Shakespeare's contemporary realities when analysing his plays, because he was essentially writing for a Renaissance English audience. So the question then is, how were Moors perceived in Renaissance England? Had most of the Elizabethan public even seen Moors in the flesh? And if not, what assumptions did they hold about these foreigners? For example, because of Edward I's Edict of Expulsion in 1219, Jews were virtually absent from English society until the Cromwellian era in the mid-17th century. So audiences would have watched a play like The Merchant of Venice, not having had the experience of interacting with any real Jews for them to reference when watching the portrayal of someone like Shylock, who is of course the Jewish lender in the play. While some scholars have suggested that Shakespeare may have interacted with Moorish people, given that Moroccan ambassadors visited London in 1600 to 1601, when the Lord Chamberlain's men would perform at court, most of the public playgoers were unlikely to have done so. And so their only knowledge of these foreigners would have probably been derived from second-hand representation through written or theatrical documentation. While accounts about Moors and Turks were never wholly good or bad, the symbolic association of blackness with sin had long been rooted in the cultural consciousness, which naturally led to negative perceptions of black people as lustful, dirty, and immoral. This is reflected in Reginald Scott's The Discovery of Witchcraft, published in 1584, in which the author asserts that, quote, "the damned soul may and doth take the shape of a black Moor." But this sort of arbitrary moral colour coding goes way back to the Old Testament story of Noah and his sons, wherein the disobedient son Cham was, quote, "black and cursed, from whom came all the black Moors which are in Africa." So with all of that context in mind, here's the argument I want to make. Othello begins the play in a position of advantage precisely because he is a political and social outsider. But he is ultimately undone by his own crippling self-consciousness of being a racial outsider. And so now we're going to unpack this line of argument by looking at 3 key ideas about identity in the play. Now, here's the deal. Venice doesn't actually care about Othello being a black man, at least not the Venetian state. In fact, they like it because Othello being black and foreign is precisely what makes him the perfect soldier. On the one hand, his military prowess helps Venice win against the Turks in their fight over Cyprus. But that he isn't a native Venetian means that the Venetian state won't have to lose any of their own men to battle. So as a valiant and able war general, Othello holds great practical value for Venice, which is why at the start of the play, we see that the Duke has very little interest in Brabantio's fuss over Othello and Desdemona's marriage. He just wants to get it over with by placating the old man and get down to more important business, which is sending Othello to Cyprus so that he can battle it out against the Turks and help Venice keep its colony. Now, this is reflected after Othello and Desdemona make the case for their love in front of the Senate in Act 1, Scene 3, when the Duke and Senator swiftly brush Brabantio's personal grievances aside to focus on the public priority. As the Duke says, "Be it as you privately determine, either for her stay or going, the affair cries haste, and speed must answer it. You must away tonight." So, as you can tell, when the state's territorial interests are at stake, they could care less about Othello's skin colour, as long as he can help them win the war. And this is made even clearer when the Duke closes the case swiftly and reassures Brabantio that, "If virtue no delight and beauty lack, your son-in-law is far more fair than black." Now, the juxtaposition between fair and black here could be understood as an example of wordplay. On the one hand, it could allude to complexion, light versus dark skin. But the Duke here actually means something else. Fair here means good and competent, while black means ugly and unattractive. Now note that these two meanings are not comparable, and that's exactly the point. Because the Duke is saying, who cares if Othello doesn't look pleasing by conventional Venetian standards, as long as he can do his job? The Duke is being expedient and practical. He wants Brabantio to recognise the need for political pragmatism and to park aside his personal grievances for the state's interest. So he's not big-hearted or liberal in any way. He's just simply being a sensible politician who understands that a good soldier is a useful man, regardless of his skin colour. By the way, guys, I'd massively appreciate it if you could hit the thumbs up button below, subscribe to my channel, and switch on that bell notification if you find this video helpful so far. This would really help me carry on making these useful English Lit study videos so that you can get top grades in the subject and we can inspire more people to enjoy the study of literature. Now, the first time Othello's race is mentioned in the play comes in Act 1, Scene 1, when Iago and Rodrigo stir up a commotion at night and wake Brabantio up with news of Othello and Desdemona's marriage. "You are robbed! For shame! Put on your gown! Your heart is burst! You have lost half your soul! Even now, very now, an old black ram is topping your white ewe." Now, on the surface, it may seem like the contrast between black and white sharpens the distinction between Othello and Desdemona. But that Iago compares both husband and wife to sheep suggests that he sees them in the same lowly because as one half of an interracial marriage, both of them, to Iago, have degraded themselves to be no more than animals. We see this again later when Iago refers to Othello and Desdemona as an erring barbarian and a super subtle Venetian. And so from this example, we see Iago's view that they are more similar than different. So funnily enough, for a racist like Iago, racial difference is actually no distinguishing marker for what is essentially a very human quality, that is sexual appetite. And so here he tries to paint sexual desire in an unsavory, immoral light. Now, what's interesting is that if we look at the rest of the play, the only other instance when Iago alludes to Othello's blackness is when he convinces Cassio to toast to the health of black Othello, which is actually a moment when Othello's blackness is not used in a menacing sense. So couple this with the ambiguity of Iago's hatred for Othello. Of course, we know it's ambiguous because he proposes numerous conflicting reasons for why he hates the Moor throughout the play. And we'll see that actually Iago is surprisingly not that bothered by Othello's blackness, although of course he is savvy enough to exploit it with others to achieve his malicious manipulations. Now, even when we think about Brabantio and Rodrigo, who respectively refer to Othello with such racially charged insults like the sooty bosom and thick lips, it's worth considering if they're really primarily bothered by Othello's blackness, or if they are sore about something much deeper, much more universal and more racially agnostic. Maybe like the fear of losing control over one's daughter, or the jealousy of another man who wins the heart of a woman he desires. So while race may continually be invoked as the obvious reason for Iago, Brabantio, and Rodrigo's animosity towards Othello, it's arguably not the real reason for their hatred of the Moor. Rather, it's the idea that a foreigner could just swoop in and take away what these men have always taken for granted as their God-given natural right. And in the case of Iago, that's a professional promotion. In the case of Brabantio, that's keeping his daughter close. And in the case of Rodrigo, wooing a woman successfully. Another observation to note is that while Othello's blackness may not be the point, his outsider status is frequently alluded to by all the other characters in the play. In fact, except for Bianca and Othello himself, almost every other character refers to Othello as the Moor at some point. Everyone else, though, is referred to by their real names only. So this clearly delineates Othello as a separate category, one that isn't characterized only by racial difference, but also by cultural and religious difference, because the term Moor referred to both Muslim, Arabs, and North African barbaries in Shakespeare's time. So by having these characters refer to Othello as a collective type, the Moor, rather than a unique individual, Othello, Shakespeare highlights the sense of distance that these Venetians feel towards a foreigner like Othello. Even someone like Desdemona, who loves Othello dearly, her husband may fascinate and enthrall her, but he is just not someone she can instinctively understand or connect with. But in any case, the Moor reference is not always used in a derogatory way. And when Desdemona and Cassio refer to Othello as the Moor, they in fact speak of him as an admirable, noble husband and leader. That I did love the Moor to live with him, my heart's subdued, even to the very quality of my lord. Micro Cassio, lieutenant to the warlike Moor Othello, is come on shore, the Moor himself at sea, and is in full commission here for Cyprus. Thanks, you the valiant of this warlike isle, that so approve the Moor. Oh, let the heavens give him defence against the elements, for I have lost him on a dangerous sea. So from these remarks of Desdemona and Cassio, is it possible then that Othello's outsider identity isn't so much a mark of shame, but instead often a source of allure and attractiveness? The biggest problem, though, is that Othello sees his race in a negative light. And this brings us to what's perhaps the greatest irony in the play. No one cares more about Othello's race than he himself, and no one hates him for that more than he does. Not even Iago, who, as I mentioned before, hates Othello for many different reasons, most of which are, in fact, unrelated to his race. But Othello is constantly bothered by his dark complexion and his racial self-consciousness is what eventually cripples his judgment. Now we see this most strikingly in Act 3, Scene 3, the climax of the play, when Othello's insecurities start acting up upon him hearing Iago's provocations. Haply, for I am black, and have not those soft parts of conversation that chamberers have. Now, having heard Othello deliver his eloquent self-defense at the start of the play, we're sure to find his comment about not having those soft parts of conversation somewhat ironic. What's particularly troubling, though, is his equation of being black with lacking social graces, which we already know is more stereotype than reality, because Shakespeare has shown us from the very beginning of the play that Othello is capable of winning the respect of all those around him, including Desdemona, Cassio, and, in a professional sense, Brabantio. But the fact that Othello says haply, which means perhaps, implies that he himself is unsure of where he stands in Venetian society. And the faint, echoing assonance of haply, black, have not, chamberers have, suggests that Othello is trying to drum into his mind what's essentially an illogical idea through the sheer force of sonic repetition and not reason. And this, unfortunately, works on him, because he soon jumps to the firm but irrational conclusion that she's gone, I am abused. And yet, none of this is built on solid reason, but instead cobbled together on the quicksand of a fragile, insecure identity. And we see further evidence of Othello's racial self-consciousness when he exclaims, "By the world, I think my wife honest, and think she is not. I think that thou art just, and think thou art not." Thou here refers to Iago, by the way. "I have some proof. Her name, that was as fresh as Dian's visage, is now begrimed and black as mine own face." Now, like the previous quotation we've just analysed, "Haply for I am black," Othello here comes to another rash conclusion on the basis of mere uncertainty, as he veers between thinking his wife honest and thinking she is not, and thinking Iago just and thinking he is not. So confusion and insecurity impair Othello's ability to think in a rational way, and as a result, he creates this arbitrary association between being begrimed and black. And of course we know that there is no natural correlation between real dirt, grime, and having a dark complexion. And yet Othello is the one who chains these ideas together with the be plosive alliteration, once again forcing a point not on the strength of actual logic, but on the stilts of language, ultimately becoming perhaps a victim of his own eloquence. That's it for this video, guys. I hope you found my analysis of Othello's character insightful, and that my ideas have inspired you to come up with your own interpretation, which is always the most important thing. Make sure that you check out my Othello playlist for all the other top grade analysis on the play that I have, which I will link to in the description below. Please hit the thumbs up button if you found my video at all helpful, and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, so that you never miss a top grade English Lit study video from me. And I'll see you guys in the next video.